Thank you, Talia. Well, it's really a great pleasure to welcome you to UC Law San Francisco. And I'll keep this brief because you're not here to see me or to hear from me, but I do want to talk a little bit about restorative justice because I've lived it over the last 5 years, as many of you probably know. In fact, the name UC Law San Francisco replaces our historical name, UC Hastings Law. And the name is itself a product of restorative justice. Our school was founded in 1878 by Sir Ernest Hastings. He was the first Chief Justice and the third Attorney General of the state of California. In the 1850s, Sir Ernest Hastings formed and funded militias that committed atrocities against Native Americans in the Eden and Round Valleys of Northern California. These atrocities were committed under color of state law and were ostensibly to protect property that Hastings had legally purchased in Mendocino County. Of course, to say that he legally purchased this land is itself to describe the systemic inequities prevailing in the 19th century. Indeed, Hastings, this is, I think, little known fact, that Hastings was actually reimbursed by the governor in the state of California for his out-of-pocket costs for the militias. In reaching out to the Round Valley Indian tribes, I learned a number of lessons along the path that we followed in our efforts to partner with the Round Valley Indian tribes to pursue restorative justice with the descendants of those most impacted by the actions of Hastings and by the state of California in the mid-19th century. I understand, of course, that each context is different, oftentimes unique, and so the lessons learned in one area might not be generalizable to other areas. But for what it might be worth, and given that I've lived the challenges of defining and ultimately implementing restorative justice efforts over the last 5 years, I thought it might be worth my sharing some of the lessons that I've learned. And again, these are fairly anecdotal. They're my own experiences, very often learned from stumbling over them and hearing from those that know this area much better than I do. So the first I would suggest is to know the facts surrounding the situation you are addressing. And of course, we were dealing with 160 to 170 years ago, so knowing the facts was a little bit different than what many of you might be confronting. I first learned about Hastings' actions when I first became dean in 2017. There was an editorial in the San Francisco Chronicle basically asking the question, why is Stanford still called Stanford, and why is Hastings still called Hastings, given the actions of their founders back in the mid-19th century. The first thing I did was to buy 2 books on the history of Native Californians and the genocide that occurred in the 19th century. Those books both talked about Leland Stanford and Sir Ernest Hastings, but they didn't really go into great depth into what had happened, how it had happened, and really the details. So the first thing I did in the spring of 2017 was to create a committee, which is what deans do when they're not sure what else to do. It became known as the Hastings Legacy Review Committee. We also hired a historian who'd written one of the 2 books that I had bought. And asked him basically to write a white paper looking specifically at Sir Ernest Hastings. And that then ended up, and it's available on our website, to be a 100-page paper looking at the actions of not only Hastings, but the government of California as well. And the other thing we did very early on, and I was assisted greatly by the Hastings Legacy Review Committee, was to reach out to the tribes, not only the Round Valley Indian tribes in Round Valley, but also tribes in Ukiah and other tribes in Northern California, to hear from them, to hear their narratives, to hear their perspective. And what we learned was, of course, they knew about the atrocities and the genocide that had occurred to their ancestors, but they didn't know about Sir Ernest Hastings. There was only one person on the tribal council that had actually ever heard the name Hastings. So we had brought that to their attention, and that was helping them also, I think, fill in some of the details of their history. And of course, their elders had not only stories about what had happened in the 19th century, but also stories about what had happened in the 20th century. And one of the things that we learned, and again, the politics were very complicated, not just California, but among the Indian tribes, the United States at the time, of course, and even some, unfortunately, sometimes today, don't distinguish tribes one from the other. In the early part of the 20th century, the United States essentially forced tribes onto the Round Valley reservation. And so Round Valley Indian tribes are actually 7 tribes. And the tribe that was most affected by Sir Ernest Hastings was the Yuki people. And the Yuki tribe is a very small group now, and they are forced onto this reservation, which is actually their ancestral land. But the other tribes also feel, I think quite appropriately so, victims of the actions that occurred in the 19th century, but also what happened in the 20th century. So getting that history, not only from historians who had studied it at places like UCLA and Sacramento State, but also from the elders of the tribes that we were getting to know early on. This is really 2017 and 2018. The other lesson that I would offer after making sure that you understand the facts as it's understood as best as you can determine them is that restorative justice is a collaborative enterprise. It's something I didn't appreciate, to be honest, when we first started. We thought we could just go in and define what needed to be done. We learned very quickly that that's not at all the case, that we initiated the outreach to Round Valley, but we heard from them and learned to listen very carefully to what they thought was important of how they define restoration, how they define justice. And that was, I think, one of the most valuable lessons that I learned. The other lesson that's, I think, related is that while you might be able to control your side of the partnership, and that's obviously not always true either, you can't control the other perspectives that might be brought to the table. And that we kind of think, when I think of my faculty, just give an example, I don't think of it as monolithic. I think of it as there's folks coming from every different direction. But when outsiders think of my faculty, they think of it's the faculty. They must have some perspective. And it is a little bit this us-them way of approaching the world that I think when I first started, I thought Round Valley was somewhat monolithic, that they would all share views. But even among the Yuki people, there were very diverse views on how best to handle the situation. To the extent on the name issue, just give a very public example. There were Yuki descendants who did not want us to change the name. Their view was that the height of forgiveness, the height of restoration was to work with us as Hastings, not to forget that history, and to commemorate their ancestors and move from there. And then there were other Yuki descendants that not only want us to take the name Hastings off, but wanted us to adopt a native language name, the Poanam, which means one people in the Yuki language. And so it was really quite diverse. And I think that was an important lesson that we should always think about when we talk about groups, that the groups are not at all monolithic. Another lesson I learned is that although one should have very high expectations regarding what might be accomplished, one should be humble in knowing what you might actually accomplish. We, of course, not only had to work with our own constituents in terms of students, staff, faculty, and alumni, We, of course, were also working with the University of California Office of the President. We were working with the California Legislature, the Assembly, and the Senate. We were working with the governor's office. And so there was a lot of political and a lot of moving parts. And while we may have had a vision of what restorative justice could mean, what the name change would mean, it meant dealing with a lot of different views, a lot of different actors, and a lot of different folks that controlled their levers of power and their levers of finances and resources. We, of course, are a public university. We're part of the University of California. So we have a lot of folks that we have to work with and we have to answer to. And then finally, I think the one thing I always tried to keep in mind was to stay true to your fundamental principles as you maneuver through all the obstacles and all the roadblocks that inevitably arise that can throw you off course. It's easy to maybe compromise along the way and that there might be an easier path to follow, but you need to fall back on what are your fundamental morals, your fundamental principles, and your fundamental values in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. And just always keeping those in mind as you move forward. So I'm going to leave you with that. I just really, in the end, want to congratulate you. We are incredibly proud to host this. Talia is just a real force and intellectual thought leader in this area. But the work that you're doing is just so important in advancing justice and equity in our society. So I want to say thank you to all you for all the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for sharing that and really just underscoring the commitment that the law school has to restorative justice, whatever that means, right, for each of us, and then the work that we do. So my name is Talia Gonzalez. I'm a faculty member here at UC Law San Francisco and joined the faculty last summer and have, I think, probably jumped in head first in some ways. But my job at this moment is really just to welcome all of us and also serve as a bit of an MC, or perhaps put my parent and caregiver hat on and say, I'm going to shepherd you through some of these processes to the best that I can with love and grace. So with that, first, I want to welcome those folks that are joining us online. We know that that's not always the option to be here together in person. We're grateful for everyone that's sitting in this room. It's wonderful to see friends and colleagues that I know well as those of you that I'll get to know throughout today and hopefully throughout the collaborations as we think about what this work is. So a few points of importance. One, restrooms. They're outside this door, and then you can just go ahead and take a left. Please choose the restroom that best fits with your gender identity for purposes of using those. There's restrooms on this floor, on the main floor, and if for some reason those are all full, there's restrooms on the third floor, and we're happy to direct you there. There continue to be refreshments, so please take care of your needs, right? So to the extent that there's coffee and tea and there's snacks, those will be available throughout the morning and day. Many of you probably have the schedule in front of you, and that's actually why I'm going to pull my phone up here, not because I genuinely need to be texting anyone or something of that nature, that we all like to multitask in that way. But to remind you sort of how we will be organizing ourselves. So this morning, right, is really some time that we're spending in this room. We're going to have some wonderful opening plenary remarks from Eddy Zheng, who's joining us in the back of the room. We're then going to have a short break and then turn our attention to a conversation between and amongst, as facilitated by Alyssa Martinez, who is the editor-in-chief of one of our journals, for some of the individuals who wrote for a special issue within this symposium. There were a broad range of contributions. There are hard copies out there, and I hope that you picked one up, but really trying to centralize some of the conversations around what we might be thinking about as equitable system design. And then we'll go ahead and take another break and we'll move into lunch. And it's an open lunch. That was intentional so that you have the time inside and outside to collect, to spend time with each other. We will be saying goodbye to our colleagues that are joining us online. Though, if you'd like to Zoom with them on your own and join them for lunch, that would be wonderful. And then we'll reconvene for what really the substance and the heart, I think, for some of us the day is, which is our think tank sessions. We are think and do. in this moment, right? We are not just simply gathering to have a set of theoretical and academic conversations. And in fact, as you probably look around the room, you realize that those of us that wear academic hats, thankfully, are few. We are not driving this conversation. We are not trying to drive this conversation. We do not own this conversation. So while we are here at a law school and we have the opportunity to gather in this way, it is not our space and place. And so it's really about each of you as we're coming together and in the afternoon session, asking the deep and hard questions in that way. And then we'll take another break. And then hopefully, because it is not raining in San Francisco for the first time, and I'm not sure how long, and we're not flooded, and we even have internet, like all of these things are delightful and unusual, I will say, PG. We'll be on the sky deck for an afternoon reception. Please do bring your sunglasses. I intend to wear mine because it should be warm enough and sunny enough. And then we'll sort of move through the rest of what the day looks like and all of those ebbs and flows. So with that, I want to turn it over to one of my collaborators and partners in this entire process, Lindsay Pointer from the National Center on Restorative Justice.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here today. We have been really eagerly awaiting this event and are so excited about the conversations that will unfold today, important conversations, I'm sure. So my name is Lindsay Pointer. I'm on the faculty of Vermont Law and Graduate School, and I'm principal investigator of the National Center on Restorative Justice. So I want to offer a warm welcome on behalf of the entire National Center team, and in particular, David Karp, who couldn't be here today, but whose team really oversaw the planning of this process. And I want to give a special shout out and thank you to both Jess Naidu and Ileana Storch for just an awesome effort bringing us all together today. I think I see people nodding. I know you've been in contact with them. So when you see Ileana today, give her a big thank you and high five for all the hard work that she did to bring us together. And of course, it has just been a pleasure and a privilege to collaborate with Professor Talia Gonzalez on this event, and just really grateful to have this opportunity to work together. I wanted to share just a little bit about the National Center on Restorative Justice. So we're a partnership between Vermont Law and Graduate School, the University of Vermont, and the University of San Diego, and the U.S. Office of Justice Programs. We're funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and our mission is really to improve criminal justice policy and practice in the United States through advancing restorative justice education, training, and research. And when we think about that need to advance restorative justice, of course, equitable systems design is perhaps the most important question. And so today is just a very important, I hope, beginning of a conversation that we hope to have ongoing in our activities with the National Center. I do have a brief remark from BJA Director Carlton Moore that was recorded and sent to us to share with you this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and share that video on the big screen so that we can have that to help set the tone for our day.
It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Institute on Equitable Systems Design for Restorative Justice. My name is Carlton Moore, and I am the Director of the Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Assistance. I want to begin by thanking the National Center on Restorative Justice and its partners, especially the University of California College of Law, for hosting this full-day training. Our nation's criminal justice system faces many challenges. Here's what we know. The United States leads the world in the use of incarceration, with more than 6,500,000 people currently under the supervision of an adult correctional system. Unfortunately, studies have shown that our reliance on incarceration as a rehabilitative tool has not worked. The high rates of recidivism demonstrate that incarceration does not get us closer to achieving our goals of enhanced public safety. That is why I'm excited that BJA supports criminal justice reform efforts such as restorative justice and community-based violence intervention and prevention initiatives. Restorative justice offers a promising paradigm shift in the way we approach crime and wrongdoing, as well as concrete practices for bringing that shift into communities. As we look to expand restorative justice, it is essential that we do so in a way that ensures equal access and addresses structures that may lead to disparities in opportunity and outcomes. Today's event is an opportunity to gather practitioners, academics, advocates system-impacted people and professionals from across the United States to consider the equitable systems design for restorative justice within the context of the criminal legal system. Thank you so much for your participation.
So we want to thank Director Moore for that support and encouragement. At this point, I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker for the day, Eddy Zheng. Eddy Zheng is the founder and president of New Breath Foundation. He works to mobilize resources to support Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders harmed by violence and the immigration and criminal justice systems. A 2019-2021 Rosenberg Foundation Leading Edge Fellow and a 2015-2017 Open Society Foundation Soros Justice Fellow, he served as co-director of the Asian Prisoner Support Committee and co-founded the first ever ethnic studies program in San Quentin State Prison, Roots. Eddy is the subject of the award-winning documentary Breathe In, the Eddy Zheng story. He is eager to collaborate with new partners in empowering marginalized communities and abolishing the prison industrial complex. So please join me in welcoming Eddy Zheng.
Happy New Breath, everyone. I want to start by inviting all of you to taking a deep breath with me and exhale slowly or at your own pace. Let's do that together. The breath that we just inhale sustains our lives. And sometimes we take that breath for granted. And so for me, it's always a reminder whenever I say happy new breath, is that I want to cherish my breath. And I want other people to cherish theirs also. My name's Eddy Zheng, and my pronoun is he, him, his. And my access need has been met, giving the care from the organizers and people. And I hope your access need, if you have any access needs online or here, to please share with people and make sure you're taking care of yourself. And I also want to acknowledge that we are on Romitish Ohlone land. And as intentional as the college is changing its name, as many people are trying to really honor the Native Americans and their land that we are on, we can't just be transactional, but really trying to learn and continue to see what we can to contribute to address the harm that was created. And I also want to share that, as we go through the day, because many of you have lived experiences and different knowledges to share, as you go through the day, I want to make sure that you find joy in collaborating, in brainstorming, and just to be joyful because you are alive and you're able to breathe, whereas many others are not able to breathe. And to start it off, I want to share a quote from Fania Davis, who is a scholar and activist, where she once described what restorative justice is. And she said, restorative justice is a justice that seeks not to punish, but to heal. A justice that's not about getting even, but about getting well. A justice that seeks to transform broken lives, relationships, and communities rather than damage them further. Let's heal together. Many years ago, my mother and my father, who were elderly immigrants, they went out for grocery shopping. When they came home, my mother always likes to go to the front yard to pick some of the beans that she had planted in the front yard, while my father was getting the grocery out of the back trunk. Next thing you know, she was attacked by an individual because that person wanted to take her purse. So she screamed and yelled, and there was nobody around, and my dad didn't see it, and didn't hear anything. And then later on, a neighbor walking the dog yelled out because she saw it, and then the person went away. She was in the hospital to get treated. I was in San Francisco. They live in Oakland. So I was in San Francisco doing outreach because I was doing violence prevention and youth empowerment in the city of San Francisco. So I rushed to the hospital, and my older brother picked me up. And he was furious. He said, our mom is in the hospital, and the person who attacked my mom is an African American. So as part of the outrage, my brother said, this black devil, we're gonna kill this black devil, right? This to our mom. And I was like, wait. This one person did this to our mom. And why are you calling them black devil? Is this one person did this to our mom, not the entire African-American population? So we went to the hospital, talked to our mom, and then my brother was upset, and then he said, why are you defending the person who hurt our mom? And she's still in the hospital. I'm not defending and condoning the individual action. I'm as upset as you. But it's not the entire African-American community that did this to our mom. And so this continued to be an ongoing conversation, even as my mom was recovering from that attack. About 5 months later, my brother was coming home to the house after work. He's tired. He just wanted to get home to get some dinner. He walked into the front gate, and he saw two African-American brothers walk by. He said, hey, how you doing? They say, hey, what's up? And they kept walking, and he stopped moving towards the door. They doubled back, a shotgun in his face, a handgun in his face. So they attempted to rob him. So he was going to give the money, but they didn't want to wait. So they pistol whipped him, and then he put his hand up and somehow, got hit in the face. And then he bent down to pick up his glasses. His glasses fell. He ran away. He came home. He said, these black devils, I'm going to kill them. Right? So it's, again, another outrage and another reaction from the trauma that he had experienced. So when he's walking the dog, he started taking a samurai sword with him to walk the dog. I'm like, you cannot do that because the police is going to kill you before you're going to kill somebody else. So he said, I don't care. I see anybody, coming up to me, I'm going to pull my sword out, right? So that's the trauma that he experienced. A few months later, I came home from work. It was a Thursday night. I remember this vividly. It's about 9:40. I dropped a friend of mine off at home. My friend said, hey, it's getting late. Why don't you stay over and then go home tomorrow morning, and then we go to work together. I'm like, I'm good, man. I'll text you when I get home. I got home. I got out of my car, a gun in my face. It's another African-American that's looking at me with a gun. And I share with this individual, I say, hey, I got some money in my right pocket, just taking a leaf. He said, no, I want everything. So he took my cash, and then he started reaching in my other pocket. I said, hey, look, it's not worth it. You got to go, man. And then he said, no. So he took my phone. And then he continued trying to take my wallet. I said, no, you're not going to get everything tonight. You just got to go. So he looked at me, he walked away, and I followed him and said, can I get my phone back? You can keep the cash. And then he turned around about to shoot me. I'm like, okay, I'm good. And so the neighbor called the police. The police came with SWAT cars. And one of the police did the statement with me. And he said, hey, if we catch this guy, would you be willing to testify against him? I say, if you catch this guy, I want to have a restorative justice method in dealing with him. And the officer say, what do you mean? I say, if you catch this guy and you bring him to me and I get a chance to talk with him and trying to understand his upbringing and why he risked his life and risked other people's lives to rob other people. And then I share my story with him. And then if he's apologized to me and I offer help to support him, I said, there's no reason for me to testify against him. He said, are you sure? I said, yes. As a matter of fact, please put that in the statement before I sign it. And so how did I arrive in a space that's so different, even right after I was attacked? And I felt my personal safety was taken away from me. I felt that my dignity was challenged. I felt that I was just, being traumatized by this individual, right? So I just felt this sense of like I was violated, but yet I was still having the presence of mind that immediately when the officer asked me, would you testify against this person? I say, no. If this happened, I would not. How did I come into terms of understanding that the importance of restorative justice is about healing? It's not continue to perpetuate harm to the harm people that are hurting other people. That's because from the age of 16 to 37, I grew up in prison, serving a life sentence. I committed a crime at the age of 16, and I was charged as an adult and sentenced to life with a possibility of parole. My direct victims suffered from my actions. My family suffered from my action. My community and myself suffered from my poor decisions at the age of 16. And it was in prison, as I was engaging in this rehabilitative process and learning process, that I was engaged in different programs, such as Alternative to Violence, such as really investing in ethnic studies and Asian American studies, such as really learning, engaging to the victim offender reconciliation process to learn how traumatized or how this lasting trauma that the direct victims were feeling because of action that I committed. And so through that process, I was able to tap into my chi, and the chi that I'm talking about is not only the breath that we inhaled earlier, but it's about culture, history, and identity. When I was able to really understand my value as an individual through my connection to understanding my culture and history, and as I understand other people's culture and history, I'm able to understand who I am as an individual, that I'm connected to all the sentient beings that I share a space with on this land. So it is that process of engaging and building relationships with people who never gave up on me, people who always guided me and mentored me about alternatives to violence, alternatives to incarceration, alternatives to punishment. That's how I was able to arrive in that space of, I want to have a restorative justice method in dealing with this individual. So as I share that story, one of the things that I'm very proud of is that I was willing to learn, and I was able to make adjustments, and I was able to build community. So when I came out, I had the great fortune of being able to apologize to my direct victim by writing an apology letter. And then also my parents wrote an apology letter, and even community members, leaders in the community also wrote apology letters on my behalf because they know who I am. So we were able to present this apology to my direct victim, and my victim accepted my apology. So, but it gone through this years of process to even get to the point where I'm able to have some direct relationship because I have a mutual friend who is a mutual friend of this victim. And so in the process, it continues to reiterate to me that if we are taking responsibility for our actions, do a holistic way of healing, then we're able to offer resources and culturally competent strategy to support the hurt people that hurt other people. There is room for healing. And there's room for the individual, not only the individual that we're talking about that who are victimized, because they are the first persons or people that needs to be healed from the trauma that they experience. And so part of the restorative justice to me is that how do we center around the victim and survivors of harm? And how do we do that by really providing culturally competent resources to support the individual and the family and the community? Because that's never separated. So as we do that, we cannot only rely on prisons, the criminal legal system, and law enforcement as the only way to address the harm and address public safety. We have to think about alternatives to incarceration and punishment. And restorative justice is one of those strategies. So as we look at the 5 R's of restorative justice, in relationship, in respect, in responsibility, in repair, in reintegration, as I'm still learning this process, I felt that I'm a little bit closer to that journey. As I integrate it, as I am continue to restore and heal myself, that I'm trying to do that to heal other people. So in 2020, when there's a lot of incidents of violence that's happened, especially that one specific case that went viral in the video, where this Chinese man in San Francisco was picking up cans, and then somebody videoed him for being attacked and being robbed of his can. Immediately, there was outrage in the Asian American community, in the broader community, about wanting to charge this individual with hate crime, the individual who just did the video. And this transitional age youth, which is under 25, had been the one who did the video. So when a lot of pressure from the media, from law enforcement, and the DA's office was really engaged in this process where the law enforcement wants to charge the individual with hate crime. When I heard about the incident, I immediately reached out to my friend, who's an African-American brother that I worked with for over a decade doing violence prevention. I say, do you know this young person? He said, I'll get back to you, Eddie. The next day, he calls me, he said, Eddie, I got him. I know him, I know his whole family. What do you want to do with him? I said, I want to have a restorative justice method in dealing with this young person. But I haven't found the victim yet. So can you wait and let me go find the victim first and get his permission to see if he wants to have a restorative justice circle. Then because of my relationship with people in the community, I talked to one of my African-American sisters. He said, hey, you and your staff is based in the Bayview. If you see this individual or your staff see this individual, can you call me? I can't even make this up. 2 days later, I got a call. They say, hey, Eddie, this individual is right there on 3rd Street. My staff is right there, but we don't speak the language. What do you want me to do? I said, can you follow him and let me call somebody who has the cultural competency and language to reach out to him? So we did that. So the individual, there was a staff from the community youth center that went, engaged this individual, and then to be able to support him in the process in taking a statement, right? So in that process, I talked to the district attorney, Chesa Bodine, at the time. I say, can we have a restorative justice method in dealing with this person? He said, yes. So then what we did was, as the community supporting the victims of the situation, and then they arrested this young person because of all the pressure that happened, and they did try to charge him. But then there's no way that hate crime was one of those things that happened, right, where he should be charged. And so as we were engaging the victim said, I don't want this young person to go to prison. I want this person to learn a lesson. I want him to be able to get support. So then he doesn't do this to other people. No one taught him how to say that. No one coerced him to say that. He just came out and shared that. And he said, I don't want to meet with this person, but this is what I want to happen to this person. So when this was presented, the media and other law enforcement had a field day because they say the supporters of this victim, they coerced him to say that he wants restorative justice, where this is not the case. So the resistance of healing, the resistance of restoring harm, the resistance of not using prison as a way to heal people continue to be perpetuated because only violence is normalized. Only exploitation of free labor, only profiting off people of color in the form of the modern day slavery of prison industry complex are normalized. So that's when I was able to really work with the district attorney's office and then work with the community advocates and work with the community members to create a space for this young person to get help, do impact justice, do community work west, do those programs that who really are holding space for people that who inflicted harm as well as people who are harmed. So then, as a result, we were able to create the San Francisco Restorative Justice Collective because we want to really focusing on how do we, as a community members, to work with the district attorney's office at the time to be able to create a process and a strategy that is utilizing restorative justice as an alternative to incarceration and punishment. And I was very clear to emphasize to D.A. Bodine at the time that this has to be community-led, community-driven, and community-implemented. And he agreed. So hence, we created the San Francisco Restorative Justice Collective. And so through many of the process with bringing people together, we had to move at the speed of trust, meaning that we bringing African-American leaders and communities together and Asian American community and Chinese community together and other practitioners to really focusing on piloting a program where we're focusing on the Black community and the Chinese community to introduce restorative justice ideas and training and practices to our people, giving them the resources necessary to have those tools, to have those type of engagement, because we know how sensitive and how difficult this process is when people are coming with a lot of harm. We have survivors and we have victims of violence a part of this collective. So as a matter of fact, Dee Myers, Kevin Martin, Richard Cruz, this restorative justice practitioner are all here. Right? They were all part of the San Francisco Restorative Justice Collective. So we was gaining a lot of traction in creating strategy coming from the community and trying to do what we can to say that, yes, we do want to hold individuals that who inflicted harm accountable. We have to. It's unacceptable when we continue to see elders and women in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community being attacked time and time again. And people are scared, they're fearful. So it's natural for people to want to be safe. Don't we all want to be safe? But safety comes in many forms. We have to invest in it. We have to prevent it from happening, not respond to it only after the fact. So it's a combination of those strategies that is necessary for us to create permanent personal and public safety. And one of the biggest challenges that we all have to encounter, there is the failure of holding the systems accountable, because the systemic racism and white supremacy are those systems that who perpetuates those harm for generations. So if we only asking for individual accountability and not asking for systemic accountability, we will not be able to create permanent public and personal safety. Hence, we see many of the Band-Aid solutions. We see many of the people that who want to invest in restorative justice, but don't want to put any resources into support restorative justice. And every time RJ is bring up in the criminal legal system, or even in a public, people would think that you only want to let the perpetrators get away from what they've done. But they don't know that RJ could happen anywhere in our daily lives, in our schools. I remember last week, my daughter, who's 9-year-old, came home. She was very excited because they make some cookies. And so she helped make those cookies. So she set it aside and she started eating a little bit by little bit every day. So one day I was cleaning up and she was in school, and it was like, it's been there for a week. So I'm like, let me just get rid of them. So I threw it away. So I was on a Zoom meeting with one of my staff, and then my daughter came home and said, Papa, where's my cookies? I'm like, what cookies? It's like, the cookies that was on the table. I'm like, oh, I said, I'm sorry. Doing my cleanup, I threw them away. Tears start just pouring down her eyes. So I'm like, so I had to, I still had my microphone on, but then I paused immediately. I just turned to her, I say, I apologize. I'm sorry that I make you feel hurt. I'm sorry that I threw away your cookie without your permission. How can I make this up to you? She's cry, and then she said, Baba is very sorry. I'm sorry. I want to make it up to you. How can I make it up to you? She said, can we make slime? I'm like, okay. I said, we will make slime together, and I apologize. Would you be willing to forgive me? She said, yes. I said, well, I didn't hear you. She said, yes, I forgive you. I said, thank you. And so when I turned to my staff said, Eddie, I really appreciate you for modeling that behavior, right, in this interaction. So for me, when I look at restorative justice, I want to see that exercise and practice in our daily lives, because we all have conflicts. We all have differences of opinion because of our lived experience. But if we're not open to accept and to normalize the restorative justice strategy as a culture, as something that is breathing in and out of our system, then we will never achieve the peace, the safety that we always seek for. So in closing, I just want to share that we are all connected as human beings. In order for us to humanize each other, we have to get to know each other, to build each other, to nurture relationships. And we have to humanize each other by tapping into that chi that I shared earlier: culture, history, and identity. Let's be fearless in fighting for safety. Let's be fearless in fighting for freedom. Let's be fearless in embracing love. Let's be fearless in practicing restorative justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eddie, and in particular, as the parent of a 6-year-old, I can appreciate the slime. We've all been there, or at least I have. And really, I understand that I'm standing between you and a break. I do want to reiterate those last few words, right? To challenge us today to be fearless, to be thinking about that as safety, right? And not safety as the traditional construction, the way that a structural framework of white supremacy and oppositional politics will say what safety is, to be fearless about freedom, to embrace love, right? The fearlessness to embrace love. And I think for all of us here, right, to practice what it means to be restorative, right? That might be in our daily lives. That might be in perhaps sharing the last cup of coffee with someone, if we're running low, or any of those types of things. So with that, please reconvene in this room at 10:30 and we will begin again. For those of you who are online, we'll see you then too.
Thank you so much for joining us again. My name is Allison Martinez. I am one of the co-editors-in-chief of the Journal on Gender and Justice. Thank you so much again for rejoining us back here. I will be moderating our esteemed panel today. But before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to give a few very brief thank yous. First to Professor Talia Gonzalez and the National Center on Restorative Justice for allowing us to be a part of this discussion and to partner for the symposium and the opportunity to put together the special edition that hopefully you all have seen and grabbed a copy of. If not, there are virtual copies on our repository, so please do feel free to look online as well. And this is a collaboration between our journal, the Journal on Gender and Justice, and the Journal on Racial and Economic Justice. I'd like to thank our authors, both the ones that are going to be speaking with us today and those that are not on the panel but have shared their works with us and with you all. And then our art contributors as well. You may have noticed in the journal that we have a tradition of also publishing creative works. So you'll see art pieces that have been put together by students of UC Law SF throughout the piece. And then lastly, to my co-editor-in-chief, Camille Piazza, and to John Ackenwohl, the editor-in-chief of the Journal on Racial and Economic Justice, thank you all so much for your guidance and leadership. And lastly, to our staff editors, who without them, we would not have a journal to be presenting to you all today. So thank you to all of them. And then just a brief how we're going to structure our discussion today. I'll introduce our authors and then ask them to give you all a brief summary of the essay in the paper copy that you all have, given that you haven't had the opportunity to read them yet, but we have. And then I'll ask them a few broad questions and then a few directed questions to get a little bit more in detail with the works that you all are going to be looking through. And then I'll open the floor to questions. So if you do have any questions, either in person or online, do send those questions in, and we'll have an opportunity to ask them at the end of our discussion. So first, I'll just give a brief introduction of each of our authors, Eve Hanan and Lydia Nussbaum from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Dean Hanan teaches criminal procedure and criminal law and directs the misdemeanor clinic. She has substantial litigation experience at the trial and appellate level. A longtime public defender, she has practiced as an appellate attorney for the DC Public Defender's Office and as a trial attorney for the Committee for the Public Counsel Service in Boston. Before joining the UNLV faculty, she worked to develop statewide litigation strategies for the Maryland Office of the Public Defender. Her scholarly interests focus on the application of social science insights to dispositional and sentencing decisions in criminal cases. She has both written and worked in the field of restorative justice. She has published on restorative justice implicit bias in sentencing decisions and on the quality of the public defender services. As part of her master's level studies in creative arts and therapy, she conducted the first qualitative research study of the use of dance movement therapy with transgender adults. And moving on to Dean Nussbaum, she is a professor of law and director of the Saltman Center for Conflict Resolution. Before joining the faculty at Boyd, she taught at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and she was a fellow in Leadership, Ethics, and Democracy Building Initiative at the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law. She teaches courses on dispute resolution and family law and also directs the law school's mediation clinic. Dean Nussbaum's research interests focus on the benefits and challenges of relying on the informal justice as opposed to formal adjudication to resolve conflict. conflict. She was particularly interested in alternative dispute resolution policy or the role of ADR, how the role of ADR can and should play in the American legal system. Her writing explores questions of how and why states use ADR procedural interventions as instruments for shaping public policy and instituting societal reform. Dr. Darrell Heller from Indiana University. Dr. Heller is the director of the IU South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center and an assistant professor of women's and gender studies. Since arriving in South Bend in 2015, he has brought his extensive experience as an organizer and activist to the work of the Civil Rights Heritage Center, transforming it into a vibrant hub of activity in the fight of civil rights and social justice. He also teaches and facilitates discussions on the difficult topics of the history of racism and white supremacy, race construction, and the intersections of race and gender. Dr. Heller spent 20 years working in the fields of human services, community development, and political activism. While living in New York City, he earned an MA in American Studies from Columbia University. He is also a co-founder of the Amistad Institute, a nonprofit organization with the mission to design, develop, and implement educational programs for inner city communities. And last but certainly not least, Professor Deborah Weissman of the University of North Carolina School of Law. Professor Deborah Weissman joined the Carolina Law Faculty in 1998 and is the Reef C. Ivy, the second Distinguished Professor of Law. She was the Director of Director of Clinical Programs from January 2001 through July 2010. Her teaching and research interests include law and political economy, migration, immigration, human rights, critical legal theories, and gender violence. Dr. Weissman is the author of numerous articles, essays, and book chapters on the political economy of gender violence, language rights, and immigration-related issues in human rights. Her practice included labor law, family and educational-related civil rights and immigration law in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Tampa, Florida, and as a partner in a civil rights firm in Syracuse, New York. From 1994 to 98, she was the deputy director and the executive director at Legal Services of North Carolina. So we have a very esteemed panel, as I'm sure you all can tell from their many credentials. So please join me all in welcoming them. Thank you. And now I'm going to ask each of our authors to provide a brief overview of their essays. So I'll provide a guiding question, but feel free to summarize as you see fit. And so the question that I'll pose is, how do you define restorative justice, and what is your view on achieving a more equitable systems design? But feel free to speak more broadly about your essay in more detail. So we'll start with Dean Hanan and Nussbaum, and then we'll move on to Dr. Heller and then Professor Weissman.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here and for this opportunity. We really appreciate the journals and their work with us to publish our essay. Can you hear me okay, or should I get closer? Okay. Lydia and I wrote an article called Community Accountability for the journals, where we're really looking at what community accountability means in different contexts. We are academics, but we hope that this isn't overly academic in the sense that we're not interested just in what the theory of it is, but what happens in practice when transformative justice practitioners and restorative justice practitioners try to bring community accountability to realize that in practice. So we acknowledge in our article that this phrase comes up quite early in the transformative justice movement as part and parcel of the prison abolition movement with Incite Women Against Violence, even the Combahee River Collective, and those early groups of primarily women of color, Black women, looking for alternatives, true alternatives to addressing harm in their communities, given the fact that the criminal legal systems that they and their communities were interacting with were, at best, radically disappointing, and at worst, just posed a mortal danger at every turn. So built out of necessity is this collective world building with this idea that there would be a way to be accountable, for systems to be accountable, for groups to be accountable outside of the context of the criminal legal system. So acknowledging those roots, we also see a cause for caution. And I would say our essay is really about carefully thinking about what happens to the idea of community accountability and the idea of community or the idea of accountability, each of them separately, when that gets implemented into practice in different fields. So I'm going to say just one or two words about accountability, and then Lydia will talk just a little bit about community and how we address it. So as you probably heard, my background is in criminal defense. So one of the things that I notice in critique is just that the word accountability is used by criminal system actors and juvenile system actors all the time. They talk about holding people accountable by making them pay restitution, accountable by acknowledging their harm. People get discounts in their plea agreements if they acknowledge harm. Judges talk about accountability because they want to see remorse. So my first caution is that when we talk about accountability with criminal and juvenile systems actors, they hear what they're already doing. They don't distinguish it from punishment. And so I'm noticing this risk that lost in translation, that it could either be co-opted or there's a risk of actually slipping into what's already done. And maybe that's even more true in the juvenile system, where they already claim that they're not punishing people, even though talk to any kid and they're going to feel punished, right? And not helped in the sense that this, robust theory of accountability means outside of the criminal legal context. And then the second point about accountability in the transformative justice context is that our essay aims to really credit, and again, it's not I don't know if we could credit everyone who has developed this term and worked on it and is doing the work, but we try to reference at least some of that and acknowledge that work. But I do point out that in the wonderful volume of Miriam Kaba's We Do This Till We Free Us, in her final imagined world, another planet where a murder happens by a foreigner on this planet, where they have community accountability as their response to violence, that there's a moment in it where at the end, the final part of after the circle processes, they take the person who perpetrated the murder, who committed the murder, and they basically submerge her in water and give the victim's family the opportunity to decide whether she would drown or not. I point this out because it to me that felt punishing, certainly in the sense that it could be ruinous to the mental health of a person who that happened to, a bit like a mock execution. And although I found so much valuable in her book, it made me, my spider senses went off. It's like, this doesn't sound like accountability. This sounds like punishment. So where are the limits?
Great. And I will keep my comments very, very quick. No, that was very helpful. I have learned to just let me talk, because whatever she has to say is so valuable. And I just wanted to say a big thank you to Allison and to Camille. Thank you for all your work and assistance in developing this piece and getting it published. So we're really grateful to you and your time. So I just wanted to mention again, that one of the concerns, this is someone who's coming from the ADR world as a mediator. Many of you may be familiar with the idea that mediation has become institutionalized into the legal system. In some ways, I feel a little bit like I'm the ghost of Christmas future, and warning you all a little bit about the real dangers of what happens when alternative and informal systems are institutionalized and sucked up into existing legal systems. And a lot of the democratic and community-based anti-neoliberal inspirations that led a lot of the community-based dispute resolution movements that were tied to the civil rights movements of the 1960s are really no longer. There are a few pockets, I'd say, in the United States where there are true community-based mediation programs. But over 50 years, we've really seen the legal system co-opting this alternative and informal dispute resolution process. And another effort, I'll say more about, I think, about the ambiguity of the word community and some of the concerns that Eve and I have about that, maybe later on in the panel. But let me just say very, very briefly, another objective that Eve and I had in writing this piece was to talk a little bit about how efforts to reclaim dispute resolution, reclaim conflict resolution from existing state systems, there's actually a long history of that here in the United States, going back to colonial times. Gerald Auerbach Law Without Justice ? Details that history. And one of the things we wanted to do was build on something that he talks about, which is that on the one hand, there are pockets of communities that are developing their own norms, their own dispute resolution systems that are informed by community values, and that those have long been in tension, and especially with the Civil War and Reconstruction, that the US state legal system has become more and more assimilationist in its expectations of dispute resolution processes, and the efforts of these insular communities to really define what conflict resolution looks like and what are the norms and values for conflict resolution, they've had a harder and harder time resisting pressure and control from existing legal systems. So we wanted to talk a little bit about that. And also what we see as two vectors, for lack of a better word. So one is the effort, and we see this really in the transformative justice space, to dismantle, to detach from existing state legal systems and create, to create not just alternative, but new and sort of authentic and expressive dispute resolution processes. And we see that as different from what's happening in the restorative justice space, largely, not entirely, but largely, where we see restorative justice becoming adjunct to community legal, criminal legal systems or existing state legal systems. So these two vectors, one is an attempt to break away from the monopoly over dispute resolution that the state largely holds. And the other vector is to soften state processes, to humanize state processes. So we see the transformative justice abolition work really following in that first vector, and what we see happening in the restorative justice space becoming more adjunct to existing state legal systems. And we sound some alarms and raise some questions there. But I've spoken too long. Daryl.
Thank you. Dr. Heller.
Great, thank you. So I entered into this conversation really kind of thinking through. So I'm a historian. Let me back up. I'm a historian by training. I teach in women and gender studies, and I also direct a civil rights center that's somewhat unique in terms of civil rights centers that are university affiliated. Most civil rights centers in universities are located on campus. Many, maybe even most, are located in law schools. They do good work around human rights. They're much more academic and somewhat abstract. Our particular civil rights center is embedded in the working class African American community in a space that was a former indoor swimming pool that excluded and then segregated African Americans for almost 30 years in South Bend. And through a collective effort of students at that university, in learning about the civil rights movement in the South, they actually wanted to know more about the civil rights movement in their own local community and kind of reclaim this space that had excluded and segregated to transform it into a space that's inclusive to everyone. So I have the real privilege of directing it. And I came to South Bend, and to me, that's the only reason I live in South Bend, quite honestly. But I love it. I really do appreciate it. But the work that we do there is really kind of community grassroots based. And again, which is somewhat unique from a lot of university centers that are within the academy. And so I was asked to give a talk, and this was around 2020 when the 2020 elections, and every Democratic candidate was asked about reparations. So, I was asked to give a talk on my thoughts on reparations, and, people talk about it in the way of like, we need reparations for slavery, which at some point just made me a little crazy because both the pushback and backlash to that, but also in my own thinking that we need to talk as much or maybe even more, not about reparations for slavery, but reparations for what happened after slavery. And so that's what I actually talked about at the time. And it was a moment when, again, every Democratic Party candidate was being asked their positions on reparations. It was kind of a national conversation for a minute, as these conversations generally go. And out of that talk and out of this particular historical moment, some folks who were at the talk I gave kind of, on their own came together and formed a grassroots organization that's now called the South Bend Reparations Working Group. That's continuing to address local issues around injustice and historical harms and wrongs. And so the piece that I wrote is really thinking through reparations, and how I think about it is that what I believe people mean when they say reparations, or what reparations they want to accomplish, is best done so, I argue, through a restorative justice framework. That how reparations is often talked about is that's this thing in and of itself. There's been this harm, you owe us, or some compensation, or and there's sometimes lip service to let's transform the system so that it doesn't get repeated, but that's kind of secondary to some immediate responses. And I'm not arguing against that. I think that kind of repair, compensation, redress is a critical part of the restorative justice process. Not a thing in and of itself, though, outside of that process. Or I think it's most widely and humanely accomplished. If we look not just to what happened in the past, but we're looking to the future as well. We really have to be in tension with that continuum. And so what I'm trying to articulate is that what happened under, and I approach this somewhat as a historian. So what happened under slavery was atrocious. I mean, it was horrendous, right? There's no way of, there's no compensation that you can give to correct that. But I end my piece with this kind of thought exercise of just imagine a world if reparations, or not reparations itself, but restorative justice process had been used in 1865, and that there had been a real effort to bring 4 million formerly enslaved people who have been related to as chattel property. But if there had been a real effort to take the words of the founding documents of this country and the 14th and 15th Amendment and really apply them, and even more so and more broadly, this is what I do with my students a lot. In there, we do this exercise in class. What if the 15th Amendment also had included women, Black and white, and those voices has shaped policy over the last 160 years? That we'd have a radically different world, I would argue. The fact that, as a historian, we look at change over time. We look at it as the roads not taken. As someone said, but the question is, why did we go the way we did versus all the other possibilities that existed? And then what can we learn from that? And so what I'm trying to do in that sense is kind of on a theoretical level, think about reparations as part of the process of a restorative justice process. And also, how do we begin to build the kinds of institutions that are useful, and not just as alternatives, but are new, that are something that we haven't seen yet. And it's a way, I think, that we, in building those, we have to also transform not only ourselves, but our relationships with one another. And that's really where the change is going to happen. And this is, it's not a simple process, and it's not a short-term, activity. This is something I think about, the work that we're doing now, if we're faithful to what we're doing in our commitments to the humanity and relations of everyone, that I look to what I do now, that perhaps my children's grandchildren will have the world that I want. But I'm pretty convinced that if I don't do my part now, and we don't do our part now, they won't have that then. So that's the broad outlines, kind of how I'm thinking about things, and what I hope to begin a conversation in the piece that I wrote, in the work that we're doing on the ground. On the ground in South Bend. And so just to say this one other thing is that this reparations, the organization that was formed is still existing. It's the South Bend Reparations Working Group in South Bend. And there's also another organization that was kind of formed up from a grassroots level called the Restorative Justice Collaborative Hub, that is really working to build a restorative justice network in our local community to address harms not just as alternatives, but again, as part of a new kind of scaffolding, new kind of institution to address harms in the criminal legal system, in the public schools, and broadly in the communities itself. And so these two groups kind of share membership, though they each kind of have their own emphasis and focus. But it's just kind of one way, a snapshot of what it looks like to try to actually actualize some of the more abstract thinking that's going on.
Thank you. Professor Weissman.
Thank you. So I want to start out and just say, we always say thank you. We're glad we're here and all that stuff. This is really amazing. I want to thank Talia and the National Center and the students who help, push us forward in our thinking. Eddie, for reminding us to breathe and connection. Think about how far out this movement is building, thinking about better ways to deal with social problems. So a little bit about my essay. It's called "The Gender Violence's Legacy to Imagine New Approaches." And what got me thinking about writing this was something I read over the summer by Will Davies, who's a British scholar, and I recommend anything he's ever written. And he says, and he's a sociologist, and he said, forget sociology. If we want to really understand how to narrate the context for current social problems, we have to turn to history. Historians. And so I was thinking about how to consider social problems, including intimate partner violence, in a historical context. And then I thought, well, really, as I was trying to think this through on some sort of level, I thought that RJ and TJ tools really help us to do that. And so notwithstanding and accepting the very important critiques that Lydia and Eve have reminded us of, and I think everybody's aware of, where RJ can go wrong, how TJ is so difficult to build, I really think that they're incredibly useful tools if we can contextualize the problems from a historical perspective. And so I'm thinking about colonial systems, and I'm thinking about the resulting wealth extraction and labor exploitation that is attended by an ideological rationale for these systems that they summon into existence, right? Racial hierarchies and patriarchal forms that shape, for example, the ideologies of masculinity and shape the current political landscape. And from that, we have the harms that are endured by communities, by families, and by individuals as a matter of racial and gender categories. The notion that subordination is a function of self-defeating behaviors or some sort of group failings has been totally debunked by stratification economics scholars. William Darity demonstrates the durability of harms of theft of wealth and resources in its many forms, and he explains the existence, indeed persistence, of income, but especially wealth inequalities, is the central problem that affects social disorder. So if we think about the workings of colonialism, it adds a new logic to understand oppressing gender hierarchies. Gender violence is steeped in the history of inequality, inequity, injustice, includes enslavement, subjugation, rape of women, systemic harms that have a long history of legal sanction and political authorization. Colonialism has implied a loss of status, formal rights for women. If you think about the expansion of colonialism in the United States, that are colonialism, it extended patriarchal norms on indigenous community. It disenfranchised Native American women from previously established matriarchal systems that were demonstrated to mitigate intimate partner violence. State violence against women was practiced as a facet integral to colonial expansion everywhere. Chattel slavery, Jim Crow, all of these legalized forms of violence against women and particularly Black women. Institutions of slavery subjected Black women to abusive policing, including sexual violence, abuses that continue to the present day if you think about how stop and frisk is practiced primarily on Black and LGBTQ populations. One researcher noted that the importance of colonialism in contributing to high rates of intimate partner violence is highly underacknowledged. So the point of my essay is that the political economic factors that often drive intimate partner violence and family dysfunction has to be considered as conditions that derive from, and to quote the political theorist Anthony Voges, he says the past, which is not prologue, but rather shapes how our history lives in the present. These are the things I want to think about and bring to the work that we do. Now, I think this also just, well, how do we use RJ? How do we use TJ? And I think what I'm saying maps so well onto, the contributions Daryl's paper and his remarks just made. I do think that RJ and TJ are separate. And I do think that when we think about harms and when we think about history, we have to think about that these harms, these transgressive behaviors that hurt people have to be dealt with in the moment. They are issues that are present, that require healing now. And I think that's where RJ offers such wonderful opportunities. Transformative justice is the longer term, structural dismantling and recreation of what we want our world to look like. So there are two processes, they overlap, they come together, they intersect, but in some ways they have some different purposes. We can't leave the harm that people have suffered to some time in the future when our great-great-grandchildren have a chance at a different world, a different life. We have to attend to these things now. And notwithstanding the dangers of co-optation of RJ, I think those tools really set the way. And then for the longer term stuff, I think the transformative justice mechanisms give us a road to move out of the harms of the past. Thank you.
So as you can see, we have a number of different topic areas to cover, and there's definitely some overlap between them. In the interest of time, I think I'll move on to just directed questions for each of the authors. So I'll start with Dr. Heller. We are specifically referring to different quotes and topic areas that are in the articles themselves. So I'll try to give as much context as I can for those of us that hadn't had the opportunity to look those over yet. But you emphasize the importance of relational justice as a core premise of restorative justice and as an undergirding ground for relational justice. And this involves a baseline understanding of what is fair, equal, or other normative ideas of what is just. And so given the stark, often visceral divides and differences on even what those principles can mean or understandings or conceptualizations of those terms that may exist between perpetrators and victims of crimes that may be based on a number of things, race, geography, gender. How do we resolve some of those divides, or what are ways that we can work on, creating more understanding around those terms?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, it might be one of the $64 questions we're trying to unwrap here. I think a lot about this. I mean, so in Indiana, it's a really red state. We're a little blue bubble sitting in this kind of sea of red. Not only former vice president, but I take a class at Notre Dame, which is now one of the most conservative law schools. The University of Notre Dame Law School is one of the most conservative in the country. Has given us Supreme Court justice. You know that story. So there's a lot of conversations that happen around it. What was said earlier today, I think that we have to be really mindful of is that we're in relation, whether we know it or not. We're all in relation. And I was having this conversation last night with a friend about the kind of what that relational. In my paper, I talk about relational justice as a really important cornerstone of restorative justice, and acknowledging and recognizing that when harms happen, relationships are broken. And that one of the things that kind of was enlightening for me was thinking that two strangers in an interaction in which two strangers, one harms another, they may not have known each other, they may not even been aware of the other's existence, but that moment, that interaction, that harm has now put them in relation. And I kind of made that statement to this friend of mine last night, and she said, I want to quibble with that just a little bit, which is that you kind of make it sound like they just became into relation because of that instant. But you said earlier that we're all in relation already all the time. And so that was a really important kind of important quibble for her to make and to push me back on, because what it means, I think, is that to be in right relation really means that we have to recognize everybody's dignity and humanity at every moment, and that when harms happen, those dignities and humanities have been violated and someone has exercised power in a way. So when I talk to people who are very different than me, and I have numerous comments, because they have this very public role in South Bend, I get interesting calls sometimes, and often from very conservative people who have either read an op-ed piece I wrote in the paper or some talk I gave somewhere, and their assumption immediately is that I don't really want to engage them around whatever the issue is, whether it's disproportionate punishment in schools, or whether it's gun rights or gun control, or whatever the issue is. And how do we make the change that we need to make it? I think we need to be in dialogue. We need to be in conversation, particularly with those people who are not in our echo chamber. They're easy to find where I come from. But that urban-rural, the geography, the urban-rural divide is, when you look at an electoral map, not an electoral map, but a voting map of the United States, you see these big swaths of red throughout the Midwest and some other parts of the country with these little blue dots. And those little blue dots are generally university towns or cities, or decent-sized cities that have diverse perspectives. And so how do you get folks from diverse backgrounds together when we're such a racially divided and separate country? And so when folks come to me, like these conservative folks, and want to talk, and my response is always, yes, I want to hear what you have to say. And I'm genuinely curious, because I honestly do not understand how some people hold the positions they do. And I want to understand, because I want to understand from the vantage point out, obviously, believe that I got a better position. And I think my position is better, not because I'm right, but because the position that I hear them articulating and the position I want to put out is different views of humanity, a different view of how we see ourselves in relation with one another, and how we see ourselves in recognizing dignity. And so that's particularly true when we cross racial lines. And I think a lot about race. That's what a lot of my work is on in various ways. And so the short answer in resolving the divide is we have to talk to each other, and we have to talk across divides. We have to talk across differences. But it doesn't mean that we talk to people that aren't willing to talk with us. It's like, I'm not going to have a conversation with Ron DeSantis, for example. Mainly because I don't think he wants to have I don't think he wants to have a real conversation. And I don't think he wants to have a real conversation with me or somebody like me. Mm-hmm. But if anybody is really genuinely open to having a conversation, I think that that's where we have to begin. Discourse is a way of connecting and acknowledging that we have relations with one another, even if we're different, even if we kind of see the world different, approach it differently. And I can talk more and I don't need to say it now, but I really do think we're operating with multiple worldviews in this country because of how, the dominant narrative of our history is presented. It's been whitewashed, it's been sanitized. So there's so many voids and silences of people who haven't been heard, from Indigenous and women and people of color, that if you start filling those in, then you have a different world. You have a different worldview, actually, even, I think. And so we have to fill that in also. So education and history, we have to really learn the full history, and then put us on a plane where we're at least operating from the same view. And we may disagree on the outcomes, but we at least now can talk the same language if we can fill in some of those.
Yeah. And I think the next question I have is sort of related, and I think draws on a lot of the really important themes that you just mentioned. So you talked about this different views of humanity, relationship to each other. And then earlier you talked about transforming ourselves and like our relationships to other people. And I think one of the things that you talk about, one of the questions that came up in our brainstorm for this discussion was this idea about that opposition that you sort of talked about. So in our American society, we have a lot of these, reverse racism, opposition to CRT, color blindness, these prevailing or becoming very popular trends that are difficult to engage these types of discussion, and can somebody who might be willing to have those discussions once they're imbued with these ideas can sort of be opposed to it. And so one of the questions that we have is sort of how do you, and perhaps you've partially answered it in terms of, if they're not willing to engage, then you don't, which totally makes sense. So for, someone who's more willing to have those discussions, but has these very difficult ideals to overcome, or not ideals, but ideas, what is a way to continue engaging in those discussions, even when it might be really difficult, or we might be coming from a very different perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, another really good and important question, because I think, well, what we've done with the Civil Rights Heritage Center is to create a safe space so we can have really difficult conversations. So we talk a lot about race, about sexuality, about sexual identity, about the kind of past harms to Indigenous people. We do film series. And what I've seen in a lot of work that's been done in this, and I think this is a core kind of understanding of restorative justice as well, is that one of the things we have to overcome is shame. And I think that one of the things that keep a lot of people from being willing to engage, or to engage in conversations, but certainly to acknowledge past harms, and I'm referring primarily to white people, like the knee-jerk reaction of feeling guilt and or shame. I've heard so many white people talk about, it's like, oh my God, I am so ashamed that my great grandfather was a slave owner. And I'm like, but I'm kind of like, why are you ashamed of that? I was your great grandfather, that's not you. But that shame carries, right? And shame is powerful. Shame just shuts everything down. And I think Danielle Surratt has talked about this a bit in her book, Until We Reckon. And I think that for me was a really useful and important kind of way of thinking about it, that we have to create environments where people can feel what they feel, but not feel judged by it, and they can work through it, and that's part of our collective work, and that we need to work through that together, because if we don't, then we don't have those conversations, and people just immediately shut down. So creating safe spaces, creating environments and contexts where shame is a given. We all carry this, and just two things that I think underlie it that we have to reorganize is the fact that we in Western culture have inherited in this Enlightenment privileging of the individual and the sanctity of private property. And I think both of those are rooted in patriarchy and white supremacy. I think that that's what continues to give those life. In that when we look at the past and we look at the harms that have happened that have made this society that we live in the contemporary world, and we see a lot of parts, a lot of values that we claim to hold that have been violated. So part of addressing the shame, and I think part of where the shame actually comes from, is people feeling, and this may be even with the person whose great grandfather did something really bad, is that we come to recognize is that we have done something that has violated our own values. Like, we claim to hold these values, and then we do this either whatever the harm we've done, and whatever harm we've done both individually or systemically, is violating values that we claim to have. And I think that produces shame, and that then makes it hard to kind of then face it and recognize it and deal with it. In part because we think we'll be judged in, for white people, one of the fears, historically around emancipation was that, oh my God, if we give these Black people power, if we give them their rights, their due justice, they're going to turn around and then do to us what we did to them. And that's kind of that shame coupled with fear. And somehow we have to break through both of those. I think unless and until we find the spaces, and I think that this is why restorative justice is so critical. It's such a fundamentally important part of the process of transformation, is it creates a way of thinking about our relationships with one another that doesn't eliminate shame and doesn't eliminate fear, but it allows us to walk forward together with that shame and fear. It's a space where it's acknowledged on the front end that we're doing this together. Even though there's been this imbalance of power where the process that we're walking through is how do we rebalance that in a way that now we're all walking with our full humanity and carrying our full dignity and the recognition of everyone else of our dignity and ours of theirs.
Thank you so much for all of that. I think you touched on some really powerful things on shame and fear and values. And I think a lot of it speaks to accountability, which is a theme that comes up in your piece, but also in Deans Hanan and Nussbaum, which I'm going to just segue right into. And so you both discuss accountability pretty extensively throughout and community as well, which I think also speaks to this sort of value identifying that Dr. Heller spoke to as well. And so I'm going to ask specifically about that idea about community specifically, but if you'd like to talk more about accountability within that, please do. And so the question that we came up with, but feel free to elaborate as you see the terms coming together as well. But you describe and explain the ambiguities and the nebulous nature of community spaces, and that requires groups to come together, define the limits of who can and cannot participate in creating the community. And so part of the question that our editors were coming up with when outsiders enter into a space of community norms as compared to perhaps an urban-rural divide, how does this complicate the understanding of community accountability and perhaps ideals as well?
Sorry, that was. You have to hold me. When we asked whether we needed to answer the questions that it's been specifically provided and whether we would be held accountable if we didn't answer all the questions. Yeah. Anyway, we will be accountable to you all and to the questions. So one of the things that the piece details is it goes into some of the sociology literature where we talk about sociology as an entire field founded on this question of what makes a community. How do humans organize themselves in groups? And one of the things that emerges, they're always in multiples of three when we come to what is this community? There are always three components to the definition of community. But one of the things that also emerges from a couple of literature reviews across sociology literature about what makes a community is this idea that community is both object and objective, that there's this aspirational component to a community. And one of the things that Eve, who's much more knowledgeable about the transformative justice and abolitionist movement, talked about in her portion of the paper and taught me about as well, is that the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective really struggled to find traction with the word community, because did it mean a geographic location? Did it mean people who had shared history? Did it mean people who looked like one another, that had shared language, religion, ethnic ties? And that they actually rejected the word community altogether because of its ambiguity and because of its baggage, to be honest. And what I mean by baggage is for better for worse, the romantic and nostalgic views that are attached to that word community. And I think this is something that we see in a couple of different places, both in the alternative dispute resolution mediation world, but I think we see it in some restorative justice spaces as well, is this romanticism around, indigenous dispute resolution. It's this idea to kind of go back to a kinder, simpler time when people were truly codependent on each other. And I'm a little skeptical about that nostalgia. I think it can be can be dangerous to romanticize past like that. But again, one of the reasons that the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective chose this word, it rejected community and instead used the word pod. So a pod is a collection of people who would, quote, turn to each other for support around violent, harmful, and abusive experiences, whether as survivors, bystanders, or people who have harmed. And I'll pause in a moment, but I just wanted to say something else, which is, so we're coming from the state of Nevada, the great state of Nevada, just next door, where back in 2019-ish, our state legislature enacted new legislation to have restorative justice across public schools. So we've got RJ in schools was the headline. We now have a governor in place who is proposing legislation that is anti-RJ, that is taking us back to a zero tolerance approach to managing discipline and misbehavior of young people in the school context. We also come from the great state of Nevada, where we had Cliven Bundy, some of you may remember him, but a separatist movement that is anti-state, that is abolitionist in its own way. And so I highlight these examples. So the first example, our new governor and this effort to explicitly dismantle the effort to develop RJ in schools. And I think is a hearkening back to Eddy's plenary comments earlier this morning, which is that you can't just announce RJ has arrived. I think everybody in this room knows that, and that it takes real effort and real definitional work and labor. And I think a lot of that labor is tied to this question of community. What is it? Who is it? Who isn't it? And I think those are questions that more often not, particularly when we see restorative justice scaled up, that question of community definition is not answered and that work is not done. And then the example of the separatist movement, our Cliven Bundys, the sovereign citizen movement, which is just as critical of the state as I think, maybe some progressive and other abolitionist movements, but obviously extremely different. Again, failure to be specific and explicit in our language and allowing terminology to be too ambiguous, I think can open the door and create space perhaps for viewpoints that are not intended to flower. Stop there. No.
So I think I want to kind of also tie it back to thinking about implementation of restorative justice systems we're talking about here today. When I was, after I'd been a public defender for a while, I was burnt out and I took a job at the Community Conferencing Center in Baltimore, where I was a full-time facilitator for 3 years. And I also did their outreach to the juvenile court system and the police and the prosecutors to get referrals. So the Community Conferencing Center did restorative justice, for those of you who may not know, taking referrals and trying to serve as an alternative to suspension, expulsion in the schools, and to juvenile prosecution and punishment. So I did it full time and it was a wonderful experience. And the idea that we're doing a community conference really resonated with me. But I'll give you an example of a time when I think that kind of rhetoric didn't match what was happening. So we were, a common thing would be when a school would contact us, the school police would have arrested a child for carrying a box cutter or a knife to school. And they'd be saying, we can take this police report and we can give it to the prosecutor. Or if this person participates in a community conference with the school, then is accountable for it, then it won't get referred for juvenile prosecution. So on balance, that is a great thing. We should have those programs. I'm glad we existed and we could go in and do a community conference with the child. the people who support them, the school, anyone who was affected or impacted by it, and so forth. And we'd sit in a circle and talk about it. And unlike in juvenile court, as most of you who practice in this area know, things would come out, right? Things like that this child was terrified. They have to take 2 city buses to school because Baltimore dismantled their school bus system and just gave all the kids bus passes, and that's why they had. But I would sit there as sitting back, not really doing much, letting the group figure out what should happen, thinking, who is accountable here, right? And who is the community here? And, in the transformative justice context, there's so much rich literature around holding systems accountable. But where do we even start? Because this child, Baltimore is still about 65% Black, 30% white, and so forth. And so this child, Black child who's going across town because the neighborhood schools have been torn apart for a school choice system. They've dismantled the bus system, but you can go back even farther and say, this was University of Maryland Law School was the seat of developing the legal framework for redlining and racial segregation in residential areas. And all of these things led to a point where a 12-year-old brought a box cutter to school because they are terrified on their trip to school. So who does need to be in the room? Right. And this child can apologize and agree not to carry a box cutter, and everyone can get a perspective on why they carried a box cutter and become very understanding. But I don't think that's everybody who needs to be in the room. So I think that's kind of where we're going with our thinking about community accountability. And if it just is a patch where it's a child who gets to do something other than go to juvenile court, that is something, but it isn't the promise, really, that drew many of us, I think, to restorative justice or transformative justice.
And thank you so much for that. I think there's sort of themes of exercising caution and consideration as we move forward into these discussions. And part of the next question, which I think relates to sort of the note that you ended on and sort of moving from this like patch to promise, and who are the actors that are considered. I'm going to harken back to the hypothetical that you explained in your introduction of the piece from Marianne Kaba's small place hypothetical. And you note the sort of unnerving nature, which you've spoken to, I think, a bit today, of requiring a community to decide the necessary punishment absent any limitation, particularly in this context, as you've just described, considering all of the different entry points that we might consider. And so community norms seem to govern in this hypothetical world, and it also requires trusting that a victim or a victim's family engages in transformative justice practices. And you note that this is, sort of the piece of that concern. And so it seems that the victims and communities are required to release sort of this desire for vengeance that I think is something that comes up a lot, or at least is prevalent in our current culture in order for this to work. And so what about those that want perpetrators of crimes to be punished and to be reintegrated, that have that sort of prevailing idea? How do we work past getting over that idea of punishment and into this more restorative practice?
Okay, all right. Well, so I thinking about this more. I was trying to think, well, what are sort of the principles here that are there? And one principle that I think is, well, there's 2 parts to this. One is, I think Danielle Surratt in her book is really clear, like if the victims want vengeance, there's got to be a limit on it, And so there has to be it's not just a victim run, right? And I think Miriam Kaba and one of her co-authors says it's not about your feelings. I'm not going to swear here. I should. It's not about your feelings, right, of wanting vengeance. This is about really coming to terms with right relations among people. And it's something bigger than that. So I think there's that acknowledgement there, that this is not just run by the people who are most harmed, and that there ought to be this thinking about what the intent is of everyone who wants accountability. But I think there's also another valuable principle, which is percolating up more and more. And I'm thinking of Adrienne Marie Brown's We Will Not Cancel Us, which is a small volume about critiquing some of the harshness with which people have been expelled from progressive communities, online communities and otherwise, canceled in a way. I don't like to use the word because I think it means too many different things, but, and what I see coming out of this is, plus the critique of criminal and juvenile systems, is what could be called an anti-ruination principle, that like the limit has to be, you cannot ruin someone in any way psychologically through shaming. You can't ruin someone by excluding them from the community from which they draw support, ruin their chances of making a living and so forth. I'm not the first person to say that. Judith Resnick is a law professor who hopes that there is an anti-ruination principle in the Eighth Amendment, although I'm not going to hold my breath for the Supreme Court to take that on. I would love that. But at least in what we're talking about, norm building, that might be a real limit if we can kind of think about what it means to ruin someone, and that whatever the process is, it cannot do that, But then the second piece is this, systems issue. Where's the system accountability?
I do not. That was
and thank you so much for that. And I think that sort of might lead into this broader discussion of transformative justice, restorative justice, which Professor Weissman talks about at length. So we're going to jump right over to Professor Weissman. And so in thinking about this, and I think you described this earlier on in your overview, this sort of transformative justice as being the long term and restorative justice being the sort of now. So I want to just read an essay or quote from your essay, and then hopefully ask you to elaborate a bit more about what that looks like from your perspective. So you write that restorative justice and transformative justice approaches serve to acknowledge the need for harm doers to accept responsibility while advocating for a form of accountability that transcends the individual and includes a broader recognition of responsibility visited upon communities by legacies of the past. And so can you speak more to this interplay between the present acceptance of responsibility and how that impacts legacies of the past and sort of what that might look like?
Yeah, but do you mind if I just jump in and say something
Absolutely,
about vengeance?
please, yes.
Yeah, I was thinking about all the surveys of victims of intimate partner violence that show that what they want, not all, but the majority, is for the offender to get help and not to do it to someone else. And it makes me think that there is a distorted narrative that we buy into, that people in any significant number are about vengeance. I'm not so sure that that's true if we really break it down and ask people what they want. And secondly, I'm not sure that vengeance is a very durable emotion. It may be something that happens in the moment and it expands. But if there's not that many opportunities for people who are harmed to really, we don't have many opportunities to explore what do they want down the road. But when it is explored, it's often, I want to find out why. Some of the really very poignant moments where victims' families and an offender, a person who is harmed, get together. So just a different way of thinking about vengeance. Sorry, but to your question, I think that, again, if we think about how to narrate the historical context of our social problems, and we can think about the history of how inequality has been institutionalized as a result of our not that long ago practices and implementation of colonial measures and slavery, it gives us a much clearer idea of how these kinds of hierarchical categories have been established. And we have to really keep in mind, it didn't vanish when we gave up the mantra, the official mantra of colonialism. Wealth extraction and its consequences persists. So I think about how does that play out, and how does that allow us to push back on some of these current practices? The history of the United States in 1898, when we sort of, colonized Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and on and on. So much of it was done in the name of the need to rescue women. And at the end of the day, we know that women did not fare better. In fact, in many places, they lost rights that they had. And so we see that same ideology and justification playing out in the criminal legal system today. So think about mandatory arrests because we're saving women. Think about no drop policies or evidence-based prosecution because we have to save women because they can't save themselves. And when I say women, I'm talking about the majority of people who are victims of intimate partner violence. When we think about mandatory reporting, when we think about the way in which prosecutors and legislators and sometimes so-called progressive criminal legal, progressive organizations won't touch bail reform when it comes to persons who've harmed in the context of IPV. If we think about what happened during COVID compassionate release efforts, none of that went to anything having to do with gender violence because we have to keep women safe. And that's an absolute drawdown from colonial practices. It's the justification and the ideology that was built around it. So I think that thinking about how those kind of ideological rationales permeate to the present, infiltrate the way our criminal legal system is constructed, you know, we have to push back through the tools of restorative justice, through the tools of transformative justice. But thinking about restorative justice for the moment, that means that, you know, and I'm going to guess everybody in this room knows this, you know, every offender is a victim. You know, every offender has suffered some sort of, you know, destructive forces of inequality, discrimination. And those are the ways in which I think we connect this interplay between how to accept responsibility for our past and move it into, you know, ways of addressing the consequences of the past. I hope that answers.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the next question, I think, combines sort of your first response to the idea of, you know, vengeance and victims wanting vengeance. And then also, I think the last thing you just noted about pushing back through restorative justice and transformative justice. And so you cited to, and I think you mentioned just now, this that 90% of survivors of IPV or violent crimes would have preferred restorative justice practices to deal with this offense. And so one of the questions, and you also mentioned sort of the lack of opportunities currently to engage in those types of conversations. So can you, what would those practices look like in terms of engaging survivors and individuals that have committed harms against them without involving the criminal justice system that might be a little bit more practical and we could take away with?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm going to bet there's people in this room who can answer that way better than I can. I will. I mean, I think that first and foremost, people want the harm to stop. They want the violence to stop. And to the extent that people have written decades ago, that might be a function of the police. Come and stop the violence. Then what you do after is a whole different ball game. There are, you know, and I'm chasing to you the word community. There are communities who have tried to figure out how to do violence interruption. That's pretty new. Maybe it's happening in the pods. It's not going to happen in my neighborhood. But that's the first thing people need is, you know, for the violence to stop, for the harm to stop. And then, you know, people need to say their story, which they don't get to do in the criminal legal system. What happens in the criminal legal system, you get to answer questions that are put to you to meet the elements of a crime, the statutory elements of a crime. And that's how your story is going to come out. So people want to say what happened to them. And, you know, that is not what happens in the criminal legal system. It is what can happen in restorative justice processes. People want to hear from the person who harmed them. Why? What? Do you hear me? Do you understand what you did to me? What are you going to do about it? Who are the people who allowed you to do this? Who are the people who tried to stop you from doing this? There's that engagement. There's that conversation. I think survivors want to talk to the people who, you know, didn't lend a hand, who, you know, encouraged staying in relationships for reasons that are complicated and problematic. So deep conversations. We all know that for restorative justice to have any kind of immediate and durable impact, there needs to be involvement and a plan. How do we go forward? How do people get the resources that they need? Again, comparing with the, and I know California has been doing some good work on this, as has New York. You can't get victim compensation unless you are lined up with the criminal legal system. And so, what about the resources that people need? What about the resources that the person who harmed needs? And let me just jump from that to where I see social justice movements moving a little bit differently. As much as there's broad recognition of our common interests around housing, around labor, around environment, around mental health, we do work in silos. And when I think about desistance literature and what, folks say about what the most important factors are to contributing to desistance, it's social justice organizing. And that means that we have to really do some intersectional work. If we know that offenders, people who harmed, and survivors need housing. Again, I work in the context mostly of gender violence, so that issue comes up. So we need domestic violence service agencies, and we need domestic violence intervention programs that work with persons who harm to be in organizational capacity with housing advocates. Housing advocates have people in their membership who are offenders and who are victims. So it's not just a one-way street. It's a mutual, we don't want, gender violence to be an add-on. It integrates so meaningfully. And I think that's what survivors and persons who harm need. They need the kind of intersectional opportunities to work together. I think that looks like transformative justice to me. I think it looks like what desistance looks like to me. I think that where we're talking about persons who have harmed, one of the most meaningful accounts I read was somebody who was writing about his post-felony life. He was selected to be on a jury. And what it meant to him to be sitting with 11 other people, and he had a voice about justice. He was, a part of the community. And so those are the kinds of, the 90% who's saying we don't want the police. I think that's what that might look like.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Professor Weissman. I think very important themes of intersectionality and how do we look at, the different angles of bringing those resources together and what that really looks like. I have many more questions, but I will open it to our audience. So if anybody in the room has any questions, if there's any questions over Zoom, we do have a runner looking at those questions as well. So yes.
Hi, my name is Ethan, and I think I have a question mostly for Deborah about transformative justice. And as I'm sure you know, a lot of the early experiments in transformative justice happened in the space of gender-based violence. And I'm not quite sure why that is, but I have some guesses. One might be that as you start to the criminal legal system, I think, doesn't meet the needs of impacted parties generally, but particularly in those situations does not meet the needs of impacted parties, and so there's and second, I think especially when there are transformative justice programs, when there are transformative justice programs, for example, in organizations or other things, you can think about how to get to the larger systemic issues in terms of trying to change norms around gender-based violence. And so then I'm wondering if you have thoughts about transformative justice outside of that context because it seems a little harder, right? On the one hand, in terms of motivating impacted parties to get a sense that a transformative process will be superior than a criminal legal process. And second, that the ask is much bigger in terms of changing the larger underlying causes. And I'm thinking about Eve's example of the box cutter. It's one thing to get folks in an organization to think differently about consent and gender-based violence. It's another thing to think about undoing economic and social inequality and systemic racism. So I'm just sort of thinking about how do we think about transformative justice in those other contexts, which strikes me as a little bit harder.
Yeah, that's your comments are really so wise and so excellent. Thank you. It is harder because people are kind of brought to a set of circumstances. The criminal legal system has intervened or is about to intervene, or the threat of it is hanging there, and so people have to think about what is the response that we want, and we know what doesn't work, and we could think about what are the factors that got us to this place. So it may come to the fore because of the way in which gender violence sort of manifests. I mean, I think that it can really work in the context of labor organizing as well. So, people talk about bargaining in the common good, where labor organizations are not just limiting themselves to, wage and hour issues, but are thinking about community issues. They are thinking about housing. They're thinking about these structural issues. Labor unions, I think, have the potential to take on so much that has to do with structural reform. We have to introduce it there. I think it's probably there in some contexts now. The same with people who work on housing advocacy. We know where housing is being built. We know what we call affordable housing, which is a joke in most communities. When we start to trace the dynamics and the factors that drive development issues in our towns, it all comes down to the same kinds of concerns. How do we redistribute resources, think about reparations, thank you, and bring that together around any of the social issues that we're concerned with. I mean, it really just comes down to a wholesale restructuring of our political economy. That's what it comes down to. And every issue, I think you can peel back the layers and show we have a political economy that we have been able to sustain off the backs of the countries we've colonized, the countries we've exploited, the nations we have just destroyed, and the ideologies that we build around that to justify that. You peel it back, what social problem doesn't really originate from that?
Well, in the front here, move towards the
I
back.
got some of the microphones in the back of the room too, if anybody wants to step up to one.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for this panel. It was really moving. Something that I think about often is that we are past the phase of idealizing reparations, and there's a bunch of experiments now for what reparations could look like. Here in San Francisco, there's a commission that is pushing forward the idea that $5 million are paid to every Black San Franciscan. In Mobile, Alabama, the descendants of the Clotilda found the ship and was able to name the story, or are now idealizing, well, reparations could look like a museum so that we can tell our own story. I'm glad that capitalism and political economy is being centered in this conversation, because the descendants of the Clotilda are naming, hey, like, we don't actually own this museum. We don't own our stories. When I think about, even in California, the push for land to be given back to a family who lost their land in Reconstruction, and they sold the land back to the city of LA, right? So when I think about political economy and capitalism and institutions that support reparation, how do we reconcile the needs, the very real material needs of people, while also pushing for these idealistic or ideological groundings of what would better serve the entire community? What are these institutions that truly support restoration?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think we have to do multiple things simultaneously. I mean, I think that's just kind of where we're at and what's necessary. And I think that's exactly right. I was a social worker for, I don't know, 15 years or so. And at some point it just dawned on me that I could spend, and I could, but I would spend my entire social work life working, saving one person at a time, and giving them the resources and support and needs, while simultaneously the system itself was continuing to chew up people and spit them out. And in one sense, I was just being complicit if all I was doing was that kind of service work. I mean, someone told me that service and justice have to happen together, right? I mean, by justice, I mean, we have to challenge and change and transform the structures that are producing the harms, while simultaneously we have to meet people's immediate needs today. And we have to acknowledge, and then when I learned about restorative justice and kind of more, I also can add to that we have to acknowledge those past harms that are still resonant, and that all of those have to operate in tension. We have to be doing all of those, I think, simultaneously and finding ways to engage in. And so when I think about reparations, and this is where the immediate acknowledgement of harm in the restoration or compensation or repair in that, for those instances, I think is fundamentally important. But as you said, you know, the system of capitalism, the ideology of white supremacy and patriarchy, like we have to continue to challenge and transform those as well, because, you know, we can pay people for harms. We can harm people, pay them, and then go harm someone else. Unless we actually engage the root of it, right? Unless we really challenge the systemic production of harm. And I think everyone has said in different ways. I think that box cutter example is really perfect, because if we're just punishing people for the harms that they did without understanding the context and systems that produce that harm itself, then it's just going to reproduce in other ways, and we'll spend our life. And I think that's exactly what the concern with restorative justice, or some folks with restorative justice, is it just becomes an appendage to the machine, but it doesn't transform the machine to stop hurting people. We got to stop hurting people, and that is the longer term. I mean, and I think that we have to do the immediate. And I really like the way that you talked about restorative justice, transformative justice as immediate and long term. I think of it as one thing. I generally tend to use transformative justice and restorative justice kind of synonymously, interchangeably almost. I don't really make a big distinction between the two, because I think we have to be doing them both simultaneously, and they're part of one process, one set of practices.
We have a Zoom question that I think might speak to some of the things that you just said, Dr. Hella. So I'll ask this question, then we'll turn back to the room. So this question from Lily says, how do we go about addressing harm in the moment or shortly after harm happened when using restorative justice processes, when it can take people a long time to be able to process what happened, what they did, or what they experienced? To anybody on the panel? Yeah.
Yeah, I can answer, but somebody else can answer. No, I mean, yeah, and I think we have to give people the space that they need, and that's part of the healing process. We can't force that on anyone, and you know, and I think that's the tension between that immediate desire for vengeance, while simultaneously tempering that when, you know, even the repair that you want cannot compromise the dignity of the person of the person who did the harm. We can never ever transgress on their dignity any more than we can transgress on our own dignity or have our own dignity transgressed. But the accountability piece really does require, and it requires the time that it takes. Requires the time that it takes for the person who's been harmed to come to a place where they can actually even be clear on what they want, that's not an immediate given, that they're going to know what they want or what they need. And we have to have space. We have to make space for that and give space and honor that. And it's not necessarily going to be immediate that the person who did the harm is going to actually make the acknowledgement and show the remorse and the apology and the restoration and repair that will come out of a restorative process. But we have to hold that, I think.
You know, I love what you just said about you have to give it the time it takes. And in that time, we're not standing still. So there's an example of something that happened in Durham, North Carolina. I wasn't involved. I only heard about it probably a year or so afterwards, but it was in an apartment building and somebody accidentally shot a gun. It went through the floor and hit a child in the floor below. And baby was shot. And I have no idea why the Durham police thought this was something that should go to restorative justice, and leaving aside, you know, how these cases get there. But there were restorative justice practitioners who were asked to involve the parents of the child in a process, and they were like, hell no. And a lot of the neighbors who knew the family of the young man who shot the gun and the victim's family kept talking. And so in the conversations, as I understand, again, I heard this secondhand, this community really had to do a lot of informal but super important work. I think it took a year. And then the family was ready to engage in a conversation with how was it that, you know, you had this gun and you were so reckless, blah, blah, blah. So I really like what you just said about holding space for the time, but not standing still. And I think that's, you know, the conversations that have to happen they're slow, they're hard. You've all discussed this, you all know this, but it's not nothing, you know, it's not nothing.
Again, I just want to just one more thing, which is because I want to go back to the capitalist question or issue, which is that part of what we've been socialized is to want immediate, quick results, and I think we have to like really change that mindset. But you know, that's why we destroy the environment, because we can rape the earth right now and make immediate profits, not caring about the future generations. But that's just part of the structure and the ideological framework that we're living in, that I think restorative justice engages and kind of slows us down and makes us realize time is important.
I know we have another question waiting in the wings. Can I just respond very briefly in this discussion, which is just to note, I think, again, as we think about implementation of these alternative philosophies towards repair, rebuild, you know, emphasis on relation, I think it's important that we not start to build a narrative that tells people what they should feel. So, for example, I hear a study, 90% of all survivors of intimate partner violence don't want punishment. So then if I'm somebody who's been abused and subject to intimate partner violence, then do I think I can't be angry? Do I then internalize this message that there's an expectation and a normative expectation that I cannot be angry, that I cannot seek vengeance, that I cannot seek punishment? And so I think we have to be careful about creating cycles where we don't make space for anger, we don't make space for punishment, and that we somehow send out a message. And I'm, again, not sure who the we is here, coming back to the community problem, you know, that as folks who are active working to advance social justice and social equity, that we don't somehow construct new dominant narratives that can be silencing and that can be oppressive in their own way.
Oh, I have one more. I just think that this timing issue is a huge problem for organizations that partner with schools and legal systems, because the school says we need this solved now, or we're going to have our expulsion hearing, right? And you say, well, the kids aren't ready to talk, you know, or in the criminal legal system. So educating those systems about how long it takes is hard, and sometimes I think that's one of the big obstacles, even to systems that want to divert more people in situations, they don't like the long time, but it just takes a long time.
Yeah. Thank you. This will be our last question. I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Also, sorry to everyone that I'm the last question. As we have been honored to hear this centering around conversations about social and economic inequality and the social disorder that creates, thinking critically about our own sector and where it is positioned in its own industrial complex, most of our work being housed within other organizations or institutions, as other sectors like the private sector grapple with what does equity look like in work, in salary, what does dignity look like in salary, what needs to be said about the work that is happening particularly within restorative organizations across the country, and the equity or inequity that exists within a lot of those organizational nonprofit sectors and what that means for the work.
We're all saying.
Well, I bet we have audience members who would like to answer that question themselves.
I mean, in terms of nonprofits generally, it's like who gets the money? And now I know there's great concern now that there might be federal funding. Who's going to get that money? You know, aside from the fact, does anybody even want that money? Because it's housed within the Department of Justice, as other people have said, you know, the number one sort of the center of criminal enforcement. Yeah, there's hierarchies, aren't they? And I know Mimi Kim, who's done some amazing work, you know, on restorative justice, transformative justice. She talks about the problems of scaling up. But she also reminds us that people leave a footprint behind. So if some organization has to shut down because they can't get funding, because they're not going to, you know, look like what the funders want, you know, she's got this toolkit that is the most amazing thing for people to use, creative interventions, right? So, you know, do we accept that, you know, there is inequity in the nonprofit world? We do. And I'm not saying we should. We accept a lot of injustice that comes out of, you know, organizations that serve people, you know, I mean, it's just, I'm trying to think of some of the examples that just jumped out of my head, but there's so many of examples where that's why I'm talking about the intersectionality of social justice organizations. Within each of our organizations, we're not necessarily doing it 100% right. Our membership, you know, are being denied leadership positions, are being denied all of the things I think you're alluding to. You know, there's an organization in Wisconsin called the Alma Center. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it. They're a program that works with persons who harm in the context of intimate partner violence. And they are required, I think they would use that word, required, to do their own work, their own internal work as part of their jobs. It's not a retreat. It's every part of the work day, or at least the work week. You know, they have to work through their own trauma. They have to work through their own sort of issues. It's totally, it seems to me, totally built into the fabric of that organization. So, you know, I'm not answering your question, but I'm so grateful. I am so grateful for you to like ring that bell, because we have to look at all of it.
Yeah.
Got a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. If we didn't get to your question, please write it down. This is not the end of the discussion, only the beginning. Please ask those questions. And of course, thank you to our panelists, Deans Hanan, Nussbaum, Dr. Haller, and Professor Weissman. Thank you all so much.
This was a team effort. And I want to reflect on that. I totally get that I'm standing between you and lunch, but I want to say that, you know, coming to the law school after spending many years at other institutions, you know, I literally sent an email to the EICs, the editors-in-chief, and we were not in relationship. And they took a chance, right? And we went back and forth of like, what could this look like? And how could we do this? And what is restorative justice? And this was literally all before I even had an email address for this institution. So I say that in that that's also what we're asking here of all of us, right? Is to take that chance to be in that relationship. and to think about justice in a 360-degree way. I had a speaker in a class earlier this week, and that was the language that she used. And I think, the last question provokes how do we look inward and how do we look outward, which is what the afternoon is. So this is where I'm also doing the job that I was tasked to do, which is to remind you of a couple of things. One, there's about 20 folks in this room that haven't signed up for any of the think tanks. They're outside. Just go ahead and pause, stop. Please do sign up. If you're facilitating a think tank session, could you just raise your hand so folks can kind of see, who they'll be spending some time with in the different times in the afternoon? We're ranging from topics from cultural competency to bias to procedural justice, thinking about scaling up, thinking about fidelity, policy. There's also a session that's going to be an artist in residence that's, really taking us in that wonderful direction. So do please sign up for those. If there are less than 5 people in one of those, we will combine, right? We will come together in a more collective way in space. Those rooms are all set up. We will not reconvene in this room after this time. We'll be over in the other building. So I just want to remind folks of that. Lunch is already sitting outside. It's buffet, well, not outside, but outside of this room, it's buffet style. So please do help yourself to what looks good to you. Everything's marked in terms of different ways of thinking about the dietary needs that you have. You can be inside in the common areas. You can be outside on the patio. So please do sort of find yourself in that way. We will reconvene starting around 1:15, and I say start around 1:15 because by 1:30 we want everybody sitting in circle together, and our facilitators do appreciate that, right? Because they've spent time thinking about how they'll spend that space in circle together beginning at 1:30. Each one of the rooms are listed on the sign-up sheet, but there'll be folks around, in particular, as moving into the other building if you have any questions in that way. So, and the last thing is for our facilitators, if you could please hang back for about 30 seconds to 60 seconds. Lindsay and I would love to talk with you. That would be fantastic. But with this, please do enjoy some time away from what is always a working lunch. And we're not doing that today. We are actually going to have some humanity in what our day is. And for those online, thank you for joining us in this space and the fatigue that we all know being in a Zoom context. And we hope that it provoked thoughts, questions, and built relationships as well. So we'll see folks back in circle in 1:15, really at 1:30. And then if the facilitators could stay for a few moments, I'd genuinely appreciate it. Take care.